Alrighty. So I had persecution in history in the context of the Roma, and the question that arose over the course of my research that I really wanted to answer, and hope I started to at least, is why is there a history of persecution? Why has this group been persecuted all over Europe for 600 years? Um, to answer that question, there's a couple of historical threads to tie together. One is the geographic migration of the group. Um, Pure question of where they were and when, but also their experience, their historical experience of these geographically varied social, economic, political structures as well, and how those structures at the same time were changing. There's also the question of the image of the Roma in the Gachi gaze, so how we as outsiders see them. And it's twofold. On the one hand, you have this wild, free, romantic, exotic, sensual, noble savage imagery. And on the other, you have this criminal, vagrant, suspicious, seditious, untrustworthy other. We can look at how these ideas have taken shape historically to kind of inform how this question needs to be answered. Um, this is just a rough map that I made on ArcGIS Online, which is very fun and easy to use. Um, so we know that they had their origins in northwestern India, and that they left the region sometime before the 10th century. From here, basically until we get to Eastern Turkey, to the Byzantium, uh, everything we know is linguistic, all of the knowledge we have. And that's a major problem in talking about Roma history, is that until about 100 years ago, it's pretty much only from outsider sources. It's only how we documented them. And when it comes to that documentation, we know that they were in Byzantium by the 12th to 14th centuries, as well as to the Mediterranean Isles that were part of the Byzantine Empire at the time. Um, we know they were a significant presence in the Ottoman Balkans by the 14th century. And we know that they were pretty well dispersed in Western Europe by the mid 15th century. Um, and then to the British Isles, Russia, etc., about a century later. When it comes to the Byzantine Empire, so we're talking about Eastern Turkey, Greece, some Mediterranean islands, the Southern Balkans in the early 12th century. And their presence is somewhat well documented. It's a lot of kind of like loose references in court records. Um, and they're usually talked about in terms of their hereticism. Uh, the early records confuse them with this heretical Christian group, and there's a lot of debate over which group the records are actually talking about, whether it's, I don't know, these actual semi-Christian sorcerers and soothsayers, or whether it's this nomadic group of metal workers who also make money by telling fortunes and training bears. Um, but yeah, they're I would say they're talked about as part of society, but certainly not a high status in it, and very much seen as kind of this outsider. This is where you first get the characterization of them as being either from Egypt or in relation to this heretical Christian group. By the time we're talking about the Ottoman Balkans, so the mid 14th century, the Ottomans had taken over most of that Byzantine territory, plus Serbia, Bulgaria, and then some northern Balkan states as well, so particularly Wallachia in modern day Romania. We have a lot less evidence for how they were seen and a lot more for how they were classified, which overwhelmingly was as just another ethnic group. For the most part, they were these skilled nomadic craftsmen filling a critical role in a largely agricultural society. Um, there's also the question of slavery, which I think is very hard to talk about from an American point of view. We have an image of slavery as very much chattel slavery and very much tied to these like legal regimes and legal race. Um, but in the Balkans during this period, it's much more of this kind of social, political, economic status that's not categorically different than serfdom. Um, there's like a lack of agency, certainly, but not in any radically different way. Rather than being tied to the land, um, the cases that we know of Roma enslavement during this period, they're tied to a monastery, occasionally a noble, but they were still able to live a largely nomadic life. Um, so there was a degree of agency that even the the serfs, the land-bound peasantry, didn't have. Um, Now, we know, as I said before, they had begun to disperse throughout continental Western Europe by the early 15th century. And initially, they were encountered as just another group of pilgrims. There's kind of this emergent class of people moving around Europe, taking advantage of increased infrastructure and increasingly safe travelways. Um, but the Roma lifeways begin to clash pretty dramatically with the project of modernity. And I think we should pause a quick second to kind of unpack that. Um, what I'm talking about there is these regimes of social and spatial control. So it's kind of it's hard because they're so integral to the world we live in. But if you take a step back, there's this you can kind of look at the history of this proliferation of borders. So political, geographic, social borders, and a proliferation of classification schemes as well. Um, the idea that linear progress is a thing um, has not always been a thing. You know, the scientific knowability of the world has a history. The and a lot of those histories can be traced back to just about right now, um, right as they are leaving this multi-ethnic medieval Balkan world and entering the early modern nation states of Western Europe. Um, Now, talking about that project of modernity, it's really much scaffolded, structured by these fundamental binaries that I think we take for granted. Um, East, West, self, other, civilized, primitive, as kind of structuring the way we think about the world as modern people, quote unquote. Um, as a kind of brainstorm, I made this big list of them, and I kept finding that the Roma fall on the wrong side of just about everyone, you know? Um, and I think that we need to think about how what it means that they fit into that other category, again, quote unquote other, so well right as it was starting to form. And I want to kind of define otherness and alterity as we go, because I'm already probably way over time. In Western Europe, what we see is the Roma overwhelmingly confined to this position outside of society, not at its bottom, outside. Um, you get these waves of decrees of expulsion, first on a local level, so on a village level, town level, but pretty soon afterwards on a national level. Um, Legislation that basically makes their presence, their existence illegal. And the consequence of presence in this land that, maybe they just got there, maybe they've lived there for 100 years, is the consequence of that is the threat of torture, branding, uh, that they could be killed on sight with no consequences, and critically, to be enslaved. Um, I would say those are the two. I got out of order. It's two-sided. One is a ideological side. So it's like pushing the Roma to this marginal position where they don't have agency, they don't have economic access to be a part of society, but also kind of reinforcing this idea of their political alterity as being outside of the group. You kind of see the consequences of that endure until, really through the present. There's a huge Roma population in the Czech Republic. I think it's 250,000, something like that. They didn't have citizenship until 1999, until pressure from the EU kind of pushed them to recognize this inside outsider that the nation, like many others, have been struggling with for centuries. Going back to what I mentioned slightly before I meant to, we can look at their subjugation through enslavement. Like I said before, the torture and violence as punishment for their existence in these territories was really a threat, not a reality. Overwhelmingly, the actual punishment for breaking the law, um, again, the law of existing, was forced labor. Um, and this was mostly like labor for the nation, but also for the town, for a church, for a landlord. Um, Now in Wallachia, so that was the semi-Ottoman vassal state in like modern Romania. There is this case of mass ethnic enslavement, and I think it's interesting that that only really occurred in the part of the Balkans with the least Ottoman control, the area that kind of straddled this Western European divide. But again, that's kind of beyond the bounds of this discussion. During the Enlightenment, we kind of see this emergent idea of assimilation as an alternative. Um, and that's where we get the first documented attempts to quote unquote civilize the Roma. Maria Therese tries to implement this quote new policy that I think is absolutely fascinating, in which she tries to bring the Roma under state surveillance and under state control by eliminating ethnic markers of traditional dress, language, naming conventions, by forcing their settlement, destroying livestock, wagons, their means of mobility, by kidnapping children, sending boys into the military, and forcing them to go to compulsory state and religious education boarding schools. And the more I look at that, the more I see this kind of shadow of a colonial practice that kind of came to define a lot of how we treat quote unquote big quote unquote primitive groups. 100 years later, you have reservations and the Indian schools of the late 19th century here in North America. And I wonder how much of this quote new policy could be seen as like a prototypical, I don't know, colonial project when it comes to populations. But anyway, the next several centuries after this kind of oscillate across Western Europe between forced coercive assimilation and sort of ignorance, apathy, general criminalization, but not what one key exception would be. In a lot of ways, the Third Reich was kind of this culmination of the project of modernity. If you're talking about regimes of classification and control, and all undergirdled by this idea of progress and modernity, of I don't know. Well, there are books and books on this, and I don't need to talk about it now. But I think it's also a really clear illustration of how the hypermodern nation state saw and classified the Roma. Like many ethnic groups, hundreds of thousands of Roma were killed during the Nazi genocide. They were viewed as outsiders, criminals, racial inferiors, forced sterilizations, ghettoizations. But they were also this object of fascination. Himmler, who was one of the Nazi leaders, was a little obsessed with them. He really wanted to keep a group of quote pure gypsies alive on a reservation to study and kind of have as like a souvenir of this, I don't know, last trace of primitive man, of this noble savage. And the fact that you can see those happening at the same time, eventually Hitler didn't let him, by the way. Um, the fact that those two, I don't know, two images and two kind of impulses coexist, I think is really interesting. But I do have a couple of closing thoughts. Like I said earlier, the question that I had here was why is there a history of persecution? And I think that the answer is because history was made through their persecution. I have a few kind of like incoherent answers to why that is, but I think the key one is that they've helped kind of structure how we think about the other and how we think about like the nation and the self. Um, I did a really preliminary discursive analysis where when I was reading primary sources, I would write down um, like what how they were kind of referred to, and you do start to see this transition from heretics and kind of like an object of amusement, a fool, like a fool, a beggar, and then you get to Western Europe, and it's this kind of like spy, Turkish spy, traitor, um, and then from the Enlightenment on, it's primitive, 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 which I found fascinating. I think it's really, I think that someone's going to write a really good book um, about that. But anyway, if theirs was a history of persecution, it was also a history of resistance. Um, one thing I loved was how they kind of capitalize on our superstitions in order to survive. Um, I think it's kind of hilarious that as soon as word gets around and all the French villages that like, oh, careful, they're going to curse you if you don't give these pilgrims alms, suddenly everyone's giving them alms. Um, I also think that the question of the nomadism is, oh gosh, I've gone way over. If anyone wants to talk to me about this, shoot me an email. Thanks for listening. I am not offended if you played it at 2.5 speed. Yeah, I'm going to quickly breeze through my reference list and images. Alrighty, I hope that recorded. Bye.